structure to this morning's session. So we'll have a little bit of content delivery, and that's going to be recorded. You'll then go into breakout rooms to discuss aspects and to feedback, and those bits won't be recorded. We've also got Padlet links as well, so again, if you can get involved with those, it can be really useful for us to see the key points being discussed. But as we've already said, it can be really useful to kind of reflect back on some of those ideas following the session today, because we have shared a lot of ideas, and thank you for doing that so far. So this morning then we looked at kind of understanding and principles of inclusion, both perhaps personally and professionally within our classrooms and our settings. And obviously, given the title of the module, that's really important to gain that foundation knowledge and that understanding of inclusion. And hopefully you'll agree that actually we saw that in reality, understanding inclusion, particularly within educational settings, is quite complex. There's lots of different factors that can influence this, different interpretations of what inclusion is. So it is something that we do need to think quite carefully about, particularly kind of in relation to this module. And I think that complexity around inclusion was certainly built upon within the Ask the Expert speakers before we had lunch. And I know there was, well, I felt that there was some really insightful and inspiring comments that were made about literature, about policy, but also about their own experiences and practice as well. So I thought it was a really useful talk and actually provided quite a lot of thinking points around inclusion within your settings. So as Di mentioned just before we broke for lunch, do let us know if you have any questions for them, because we may be able to pass those on. So that might be really helpful to you. But what was really nice actually from those sessions is the excellent practice that is being done. And it might be that you have practices within your own setting that were quite similar and demonstrated that, or if not, you might be thinking maybe that's something that we could do. But that's what those sessions are about, providing that opportunity to share that practice. So we're going to develop our kind of thinking about inclusion a little further this afternoon, and think about certain aspects in a little bit more detail. So there's kind of two parts to this. The first part looks a little bit about understanding the needs of a range of learners within our setting and what we mean by successful inclusion. And then we're going to move on then to think about inclusion within your own school's policy, and Laura will be taking you through kind of the second part of that session today. So let me just move the slide on for you. So the first aspect, like I said, that we're going to look at today is looking at experiences of supporting learners with different areas of needs, and how we might have done that within our settings. And I'm sure that we touched on this within some of the discussions this morning. So it's just about thinking about this a little bit more specifically. And this does actually link to an activity in PebblePad, so it's activity 12 and the information surrounding that. So you might want to make a note of that, because you can kind of go back through that material retrospectively following the discussions today. So I'm going to give you opportunity to discuss some of the ideas around this in a moment. But before we do that, we're just going to highlight some of the key points really around the areas of need, particularly as you wouldn't have had a chance to look at that on the PebblePad. Now, many of you, if not all of you, will be aware what we mean by the areas of need, because you work with learners with a range of needs every day within your role, and it's obviously something that's referred to within the code as well. So it's very likely that most of you will have an awareness of this because of your everyday role. But sometimes I think it's quite nice to take a step back and kind of draw out explicitly what we mean by terms. It takes us back to the fundamentals, if you like, and gets us to really think about what it might mean. So I'm just going to draw out a couple of things. So in terms of a bit of context, really, the areas of need originally came from the Warnock report, which we've also mentioned today. And it was kind of a response to the more rigid medical categories of disability within education legislation. And the Warnock report introduced the areas of need as a broader, more inclusive idea to focus on educational needs rather than the label, rather than the deficit. And actually, these areas of need, in terms of what was introduced in Warnock, we can kind of see within our policy today as well. And essentially, the areas of need are a way of recognising that not everyone learns in the same way, but it describes the kind of the broad challenges a learner might face helping, us to address their needs and provide the right kind of support for those children. And I think we've already had some lovely examples of this, particularly within the Ask the Expert sessions. So that was really nice to see. An important aspect to kind of highlight in terms of the areas of need is it is about their educational need, not necessarily about a label. And again, we touched on some of the debates that might sort of happen around that, and there's lots of debates around labels in the literature if you are interested in that. But it is about the educational needs, not necessarily about their label. And again, we saw that drawn out from the Ask the Experts too. Another point is that there is a wide spectrum of additional learning needs, and that a child or young person, may have a mild need or a more complex and severe need, and actually that these may kind of develop or may change over time. Additionally, a child or a young person may have needs that fall into more than one area, so needs that might overlap or interrelated needs, if you like. So a very basic example is a child with a hearing impairment may have sensory needs, but also may have communication and interaction needs. So the areas of need allow us to view aspects of need a little bit more broadly, a little bit more holistically in order to support those learners more effectively. And the four broad areas of need that are referred to in the ALN code are listed on the slide there. And again, you will more than likely be familiar with these. Communication and interaction. So here we're talking about learners that might have challenges with speech language communication. Cognition and learning. So learners here might have difficulties in understanding, remembering or processing information, and it might refer to children that have specific learning differences or perhaps more general learning difficulties as well. Behaviour, emotional and social development then. So a child that might have needs in this area might have difficulties managing emotions, behaviour, have challenges with mental health, might have difficulties in terms of regulating themselves emotionally. They might have introvert behaviours such as being withdrawn, isolated, or perhaps more extrovert behaviour, so being disruptive, challenging behaviour, hyperactivity, etc. And then the final area of need is that sensory and physical need. And again, a child that might have needs in this area, might have challenges in terms of hearing, with their vision, perhaps with movement or sensory processing. And it could come from a physical disability, or it might come from visual hearing loss or other kind of sensory processing difficulties. And being aware of these needs is valuable because, as I said, it can help us to support learners more effectively. It allows us to provide that more tailored, that more targeted support, perhaps more individualised interventions, strategies, etc. I should say as well, before I move on and forget, that there is a link on PebblePad when you're going through this material to the Welsh Government guidance on ways that you might support particular learners with certain needs. So that might be useful just to be aware of. And I'm going to refer to a few things throughout this session. So I'll pop the links in towards the end of the session for the different bits that I refer to in a moment. But yeah, understanding needs can be useful because it can help us provide that support to children. But as I was preparing this session, I thought it might be useful to kind of link the areas of need to and how understanding the areas of need might help us support a more inclusive classroom. So that's what I want you to just reflect on for a moment. Think about how having an understanding of these different areas of need and understanding that idea might allow us to provide a more inclusive classroom or a more inclusive setting. So I'm just going to give you a minute or so. I'll just be quiet for a couple of minutes and let you think individually and jot down a few ideas. Okay, so hopefully that was enough time to have a little think about that. And hopefully you've jotted a few points down on your paper, whatever it might be. Please feel free to pop them in the chat if you want to share those ideas. I'm not going to ask for feedback just because we are recording. But I will just share some of the points that I noted down when I did that activity for myself, if you like. By having kind of an understanding of the areas of need, it can help create a more flexible and inclusive learning environment. Because by recognising, the diverse range of learners in our classroom, we're able to adapt the curriculum, the teaching methods, and perhaps the assessment approaches as well to remove those barriers and support participation, which might involve a greater range of learners. And actually, in doing that, in making those changes for, to support children, it might actually be beneficial for all learners. So, for example, if you provided, a more clear structured instruction that might benefit somebody who has difficulty retaining information or processing information, that might help that particular student, but it also might help make the learning more organised and more predictable for a number of other children within the class as well. And thinking about the different range of needs that we have in our classroom can help us move beyond differentiation towards more inclusive design, more inclusive pedagogy, where that flexibility can benefit everybody. And I think that was touched on by some of the Ask the Expert speakers as well, being flexible and adaptive with what you're doing within your settings. And I think from doing this then, by having that awareness of learners' needs, of the varied needs, we can create that kind of classroom culture that values diversity and inclusion and promote that sense of belonging. So rather than, viewing the differences as a challenge, and perhaps that aligns with the medical model, which we talked about a little earlier, children can feel valued and included within that classroom and enrich that environment. And again, that builds further into this idea of an inclusive ethos. So understanding the areas of need can help to develop that, where every learner is then given the support and the respect that they might need to thrive, and to ensure that no one is going to be excluded. And I think that, again, to refer back to the experts, it's about changing that school for the child and it being ready for them within that school. So just a couple of ideas I put down. You may have had very similar, you might have had a few different ideas, but like I said, please do feel free to pop them in the chat if you like. I'm conscious I've been talking for a little bit, and before I give you the opportunity to have a discussion about this, I just wanted to note another aspect related to this particular area. Now, one of the a recent research study done by Kathy Knight, who was actually one of our Ask the Expert speakers last year and used to teach on this programme when it first started. Kathy has done quite a lot. I'm going to talk about that research article now, but just to give you some context, Kathy has done a lot of work on the new ALM framework, looking at how it's been perceived, how it's been implemented, particularly in relation to inclusion. And in this one article that I'm talking about from 2022, and again, I'll pop these in the link towards the end of the session, in the chat, sorry, towards the end of the session. In this one article from 2022, Kathy looked at teachers' perceptions of inclusion and actually found that there were kind of caveats or stipulations to when inclusion could be provided. So whilst all teachers kind of subscribed to this idea of inclusion and believed in it, they also expressed when there were limits for learners with ALN, particularly within mainstream classes. And those limits were around practical difficulties or challenges. And actually, one of the challenges, which is why I'm kind of referring to this here, it was related to an area of need, and that was related to challenging behaviour or behavioural issues. So it's quite interesting to raise at this point, and something that you might like to reflect on either in your own time when you're working through that pebble pad, or it might come up with some of the discussions in a moment. And that brings us quite nicely then onto your next activity, which is listed on the slide there. But what I'd like you to do is to go into the group and have a discussion around the areas of need and how you support learners with a range of learning needs within your setting. What strategies have you used and why? What are the challenges that you faced supporting learners with a range of needs? What challenges have the learners faced? And then importantly, and I think that's what's really lovely about these sessions, think about how you might have overcome those within your settings, because that then allows that sharing of good practice, again, that was reflected in the talks earlier. But that can be really, a really useful point. So what I'd suggest is have a chat around some of those questions and supporting a range of needs, and then spend a couple of minutes uploading those points. The Padlet link, I think I heard a ping, so it might be in the chat now, but you're just focusing on the first 3 columns, which align with the research questions, the questions on the slide there. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes for this activity, so I will call you back at just before the hour at 58.
Sorry, Meg, are we breakout rooms or?
Yes, sorry, Christina.
Yeah, no, fine.
I should have signposted you.
There we go. Should be going over now, guys.
Thank you.